Welcome to the Reggie McNeil Podcast, where we explore what it means to seek God's kingdom here on earth. Join us on our journey to become more aware of and encouraged by God's work in and around us. Welcome to the Reggie McNeil Podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Barton, and I'm here with Reggie McNeil. In our last episode, you observed that Jesus showed greater concern for bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth than merely getting people from earth to heaven. So how does this dynamic play into Jesus' establishing the church?
Yeah, well, I want to say right off the bat, Jesus didn't come to establish the church. I grew up, by the way, with, I think, that understanding that that's what Jesus came. He came to, die on the cross, and so we could, get forgiven and go to heaven. But and he established the church. But that's really not Jesus' mission. He came to reveal the kingdom. Now, he establishes the church with a specific role in mind as part of his revelation of the kingdom. The one time that he talks about the church is the establishment of it. He talks about the kingdom of heaven over 90 times. He talks about church twice. It's the same thing repeated in two of the Gospels. And so when he establishes the church, though, it's even that, and he talks about the church, it's in the backdrop of the kingdom. I mean, it's the episode is they're pulled over to rest area, whatever. They're on a rest stop, and Jesus says, "What?" Ask his guys, "What are they saying about me out there?" And so they give him a few answers. Some say you're Elijah, some say you're John, And then he says, "Well, who do you say I am?" And Pete pipes up, "You're the Christ," to quote, use King Jimmy language, Son of the living God. And Jesus replies back, "Well, you got it right, Pete. You had a little help, but you got it right." And then he goes on to establish the church on this foundational belief and rock. He says, "And I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and the stuff that you bind up here and the stuff that you loose here." All of this is rabbinic speak. I didn't understand that, growing up. But you got to get back into the first century world to understand what's going on in all that discourse. When a disciple of a rabbi, whether it was Shammai or Gamaliel, whoever, reached a certain level that the rabbi thought his disciple got it, then the rabbi would give that disciple a key. Literally, it was something they had. It was physical. You could know someone's worldview, their opinion about Scripture, about the afterlife, about Jewish laws and tradition, whether it's food or whatever. You could know all that from just simply seeing their key, because you would know that system of thought is who they'd been schooled by. Well, the disciples had just passed the final exam. Peter says, "You're the Christ," and so they've reached a certain level. And Jesus says, "I'll give you the keys of the kingdom." Now, whether or not he handed out anything, but metaphorically, as the rabbi, he's saying to all, and I want you to have my key. Well, what would Jesus' key be but the heaven, about the kingdom of heaven, because that's what he talked about. That's what he lived. That's what he did. So, and he says, and everything that you do is going to reflect on, you need to live out kingdom values and kingdom desires and kingdom kinds of expectations and stuff. You need to live that out, because whatever you show folks is what they're going to get. That's what they think it is. Now, he uses a word. He doesn't invent the word church. I mean, it's a word right out of that. And again, if you understand the first century world, the ecclesias of these villages typically were elders, and they were charged with the well-being of the village, so that when the ecclesia gathered, they were discussing community issues and all that kind of stuff. It would make no sense for that ecclesia to suddenly say, we're the point of it all. I mean, the village exists so we can have an ecclesia. Are you kidding? I mean, or you should be at our ecclesia meeting. I mean, it was fabulous. I mean, we had the town's going to, Hades, but we're having great. We're in a 6-week series. I mean, none of that makes sense if you understand what's going on in the first century. So Jesus borrows that image, and he says, I'm appointing you as elders to look after this kingdom that I'm saying is already here. That's your job. And so the church has one job. It's not hard. What is that AT&T commercial right now? It's not complicated. I mean, we have made it complicated, but it's not hard. And it's not about our survival and about the church's, vision and life and all that. The church has one job, and that's to point this world to the kingdom, to another way of living, to another life than what most people are experiencing. And so that's why a church centric view, which puts all of the emphasis and scorecard on the church, is really an errant, is a misunderstanding of our mission.
So when you talk about the church, what exactly do you have in mind? The institution or something else?
Yeah, well, obviously, I've got there are institutional manifestations like of any movement or everything, but when I talk about the church, I try to go back to its core identity, which, by the way, is a narrative that goes all the way back to Genesis 12, where God creates a people. It's the call to Abraham. The church, those elders, it's clearly when Jesus chooses 12, that's not disciples. It's not like, that's as many seats as we have on the bus, or whatever. I mean, he's setting up the new Israel. So it's Abraham's call that's still the initial covenant that God forms with Abraham, and then what Abraham's job was. So God says to Abe, I'm going to bless you. Your job's turn around and bless the world. Well, Israel struggled with that. Their entire being it was always the tension between the priests and the prophets. The priests would also always set up religion. The prophets would always come in and say, but we have a mission here in the world. And so it was always, and Jesus clearly comes down on the prophet side. He's identified in that regard. And so I think then to think of the church in any other terms besides its basic relationship. We are the people of God. That's the biggest narrative of the whole thing. And that's the narrative I think we stepped into. But as the people of God, we have a role to play. It doesn't mean we're the people of God, so we are in, you're out. No, the church is the people of God partnering with him in his redemptive mission in the world. I mean, there's a responsibility of what it means to be the people, not just privilege. In fact, we are privileged to be responsible, to actually know what's going on, to be co-conspirators with God in the advent of His kingdom. And so, that's our job. Really, is He's decided to cut us in on the deal as partners. Does He need us? No, but God decided to do it this way. He wasn't going to do it by Himself. And the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you get God kind of operating in this solo manner with different things with Noah or the garden. Since Genesis 12, God's decided He's going to work through humanity to the point that He assumes human flesh and comes and walks among us and says, I want you, this is what I have in mind for you. So I think when I think of the church, I think of us in our relational, our relationship with God, but our relationship to the world as people of covenant to bless the world.
So you write and speak about our need to move from this church-centric to kingdom-centric ministry paradigm for the church. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's particularly those of us who are 500 years into the Reformation. We've had centuries now of trying to fix the church, and everything has been focused on getting the church right. And then when you marry the church to American marketing, and then you start having, and the scorecard becomes how many people you have at church and the success of your programs and all of that, then and then that gets wedded to the congregation, and a congregation that is growing, and and it can pull off programmatic wins, is deemed a good, healthy church, and smaller churches are less so. Whatever. When you begin to confuse all that, and you begin to just focus all your efforts like on church renewal, church health, church everything, church vision, church growth, church whatever you put in there, the emphasis is on the church. And I'm saying that God's mission in the world is not to grow the church. I mean, Jesus said, "I'll take care of the church. Your job is to point people to the kingdom." That's supposed to be our focus of our mission. In many ways, the church doesn't have a mission. The mission has a church. And God's mission is the kingdom, and it has a people who are responsible for pointing people to that mission. And if we make it all just about how people are related, I mean, I grew up in a world, and it still operates, where you prove your commitment, to Jesus primarily through your church expression. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying, but church as institution, has those kinds of overtures and all. Then it can get pretty fuzzy about, is this, are we converted to Jesus, or are we converted to the church? Have we turned from our world, or have we basically married, worldly stuff into a church expression? And then if it grows and takes off and multiplies and franchises, then that's a sign of God's obvious blessing. I think we missed something in there. I think the kingdom focus then says, all right, we're responsible for our community, just like the church that Jesus day. How can we even believe that we are being faithful to our mission if we say, yeah, well, our attendance is up 100 this year, we've had a good year, we met budget, we met all our church goals, but the rates of divorce went down, murders went up, crime, families fell apart. More people are on opioid addiction. People are hating each other more. They're dividing into camps right and left. I mean, it seems crazy that we would say that, well, we'll just take our own measure of health and success if we're okay. Doesn't matter what condition the town's in. So I think a kingdom-centric focus forces you to be steward of much more than, and that then calls you out to play with other followers of Jesus who in other congregations now, instead of being a competitor with first whatever, and second whatever, now you are the body of Christ in a town supposedly looking after the kingdom benefits in that town.
So what are some practical ways that church leaders could center more on this kingdom-centric approach? And conversely, if people are searching for a church or a missional community or whatever, how can they identify whether or not they're kingdom-centric or not?
Well, the answer is a great question, and it's a twofold answer, but they're related. To the leader first, I would say nothing short of a culture change is going to pull this off. Mm-hmm. This can't be the fall program. It's not a new emphasis. This is a major shift. This is as big a shift as the move from a Ptolemaic universe to a Copernican universe. Mm-hmm. I mean, the center of gravity changes. The kingdom, the church, in the church-centric world, the church is the center of gravity, and all the activities and all the programs that spin around the church. When the kingdom-centric, you move the kingdom into that, then the church moves to a lesser spot. It's not the center of the universe. It has a role to play, but the kingdom is. So you've got to pull off a huge culture change. And I'll tell you, there are three things you have to do, and you don't get a pass on 2 out of 3. You have to do all 3 of these. You have to change the story, first of all. The narrative, in other words. What is the narrative of your church, your let's just say this is a congregational expression. You have to change. What are we about? Are we about being a great congregation? Can we crow about, we've got the finest this or that, our food's great, our customer service, we have valet parking, and you can't believe the music? Or is it about, the narrative of God's story and what he's up to in our community and how we're partnering with that? And I know this is not either or, because you are going to have to talk about it. So, I'm not that naive. But the point is, what is the big plot What captures 90% of your talk? I mean, you can tell. You can tell if folks are in it for them or we're really here for everybody else, and how we spend our money, what we talk about, all those kinds of things. Second thing that you have to change is the scorecard. In the church-centric world, it's all church. It's church statistics. How many people come to church? How often do they come? How much money do they bring? How, just on and on. And how many people participate in our programs? Is this program doing well? In fact, even at church leadership conferences, we talk about programs as if they're people. I mean, I keep trying to tell church leaders all the time, God is not in the church business. He's in the people business. And that's that's the business we're supposed to be in. So when we refer to our churches and all in as a connection of programs and stuff, somehow we've missed this. For instance, I'll even ask pastors sometimes, how many better marriages do you have in your church than you did last year? And they look at me like I've got one eye in the middle of my head, and I'm saying, well, and they say, we don't know that. I mean, well, why don't we know that? I mean, if God's intentions are that people enjoy good, I promise you, people who are married care about that. They care about whether or not they have a good relationship with their kids. Why don't we ask that question? They care about whether or not they have a better outlook on life, or if they're depressed or they're anxious stuff. Why don't we ask that question? How many more depressed people do we have than we did last year? Who's dealing with the demons of whatever oppression there is, whether it's addiction or psychological stress, whatever. No, we don't use people metrics, and that betrays, I think, a lack of real attention to the main business. The third thing you have to change, now I'll alliterate this so it'd be easy for me to remember. So you change the story and you change the scorecard, you have to change, again, your stewardship. That's the leadership. What do you think you're responsible for? Which means when I do hand-to-hand combat with church leaders and I'm thinking them and working with them through things, we talk about how they spend their time, where they're their own personal scorecards. What investments are they making in the community? What relationships do they have with other church leaders? What relationships do they have with leaders in other efforts? I mean, other sectors of their society. Because most of the stuff that we really need to deal with, the big societal issues in America, come down to a cross-domain concern. It takes more than just one person barking over here to get something done. You got to work with education and business and politics and healthcare across the board, whatever it is. So I think now for the individual member, I would look for a place within to use your word conversely, that I would look at, is the story I'm hearing from these people about the kingdom, or about how fabulous they are and how great this place is and how privileged it is to be a part of this, and don't you want to tell your friends so they can be all right? And I'm not arguing the church should be bad. I'm just saying, but what is the main story? And what gets celebrated? Because that's what the scorecard is. That's what gets celebrated. So I would pay attention to that, and I would want to be around people that feel some responsibility for the kingdom, for the community, as an expression of their commitment to the kingdom, rather than we're building this magnificent tower that's going to reach heaven. Come with us. I mean, what do we think that story is about? So I would be nervous of climbing on anyone else's tower, of Babel. So I think that's what I would look for.
You say we are seeing the rise of the post-congregational church. Does that reflect a growing kingdom awareness?
I think it does, and I'll tell you why. We've had, basically, in the Western church, for the last 1,700 years, we've had one way of doing church. We've had one quiver in one arrow in our quiver, and that's the congregation. Now, it wasn't the first life form in the taxonomy of the church. The first life form was the house church. And so what we're seeing now, I think, in the move from church as institution to church as movement, which is what the move from church-centric to kingdom-centric pulls off. Whenever there's a new movement, there are new expressions that come to the fore, and I think we're seeing an expansion in the bandwidth of how church expresses itself. Still, congregation's fine, but there are millions of people in our own country, and an increasing number of people, by the way, that are not susceptible to being congregationalized in their spiritual journeys. Their life rhythms don't match the congregation. Maybe they work on Sunday. Maybe they're gone 3 weeks out of the year traveling. Or out of the month traveling. There are all kinds of reasons that the congregational every 7-day rhythm just doesn't fit their life anymore. And so I'm seeing church as restaurant. Now, by the way, I know there are people listening to the podcast that, from a church-centric world, we decide what's a real church. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about what the church is, not a church. And the church is an expression of the people of God partnering with Him in His redemptive mission. So I see people who are, pursuing church as restaurant. They're pursuing church as their business. I won't use names here because these, businesses go. I'm not trying to get folks distressed with people that may not see it the way they do. But I sat with business owners not long ago that had thousands. They are the biggest company in their industry in North America. And they said to me, our business is our church. And they literally build communities for their workers. And I don't mean this in a spooky kind of way like The Circle or whatever that novel was or whatever. But I'm talking about to give people who are working in minimum wage, who can't get stuff that a lot of people can by virtue of the wealth that they've inherited or comes down to them or the jobs they have, because you're not going to get much of a mortgage at $15 an hour. And so they literally build communities. They set pastors up in the communities for these folks, along with schools, along with health clinics and stuff like that. Now, in fact, my granddaddy came out of the mill village of Georgia, North Georgia, which had a little bit back then. The mills kind of did the same thing. They built housing, and they had a mill store, and everything got charged to your account in the mill. It can feel constricting, but it gave people a chance to move up from a certain level of life. And because people came out of that mill village and went on and made lives, like my own family. So my point being is these folks are poor now. They are they are churching. They see church as a verb. Maybe that's the best way to say it. It's not a thing. It's a way of being in this world. They church their way through their business. I'm seeing churches, sports club. I'm seeing just a wide variety. So I think, in its missional communities, as people, I'm thinking of one church that multi-sided through being mentors in multiple schools in their District 9, to be exact. And this is in a non-Bible Belt state. So I'm not talking about, I'm talking California here, where. So they were able, through serving very well, to gain the respect of the school system, and they provided a bunch of stuff. And now they're even thinking about a network of missional communities that is literally dispersed along the spine or the network, not a single spine, the web of those relationships in those 9 places where they have people that are mentoring every day. I think it's brilliant. I think the network church is where we're headed. COVID has pushed us, the church out onto the street. And I think we're going to be looking for new ways for the church to exist, not just in digital form, in internet, which is a lot of that is still just taking what's going on in the building and pushing it out. But people are literally figuring out how to love their neighbors and serve their communities and are creating, churching their way through every aspect of their life.
What are some implications for kingdom-centric living for those of us who identify as Jesus followers?
Well, I think, and I want to talk about that. That's a good segue into our final podcast in this series, because if this doesn't have personal implications, it's still just left up to, theological inquiry and reflection, when in fact, I think it means that you and I, if we profess to follow Jesus, then we have said He is our King. And His kingdom is, because it's important to Him, it's important to us. That would be like being married and You don't care what's important to your husband, wife. No, if you're married, the stuff that gets important to one gets important to both if it's a healthy relationship and there's communication. Well, that means then that I've got to figure out how I am a person of blessing, partnering with God in His redemptive mission right in my own world. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit in our next episode.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for joining us. You can find more of Reggie's work on his website, reggiemcneil.org, or on Facebook and Twitter at Reggie McNeil. Stay tuned for the next episode on The Kingdom and You.